In the year 1597, a fleet of over 130 Japanese warships sailed to destroy the last remnants of the Joseon Navy. What they found waiting for them were just 13 battered ships, led by an admiral who had been tortured and left for dead by his own king. The battle that followed should have been a slaughter. It wasn't. The story of how this disgraced admiral achieved the impossible begins not at sea, but in the suffocating darkness of a prison cell, where a nation's fate rested on the will of a single, broken man. Here, Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the nation's greatest hero, sat in chains. The cold stone of the cell leached warmth from his bones, a constant dull ache that mirrored the one in his heart. For 6 years, he had been the sole reason his country had not fallen. From the deck of his flagship, he had seen the smoke of burning villages on the horizon and met the enemy's ambition with tactical fire. His innovative crane wing formation had turned naval engagements into masterfully conducted orchestrations of destruction. He had never lost a single battle, never surrendered a single ship. His name had become a prayer on the lips of his people and a curse in the mouths of his enemies. But his victories had earned him a more insidious foe, his own paranoid king, who saw the admiral's fame not as a shield for the nation, but as a threat to his throne. Whispers from jealous rivals in the royal court, slick as venom, twisted his triumphs into acts of defiance. A carefully laid Japanese trap of disinformation was the final push the king needed. Convinced his greatest general was a traitor, he had Yi arrested, dragged to the capital in disgrace, and subjected to brutal torture. They broke his body, but they could not break his will. In his place, the king appointed an arrogant and reckless rival, a man who coveted Yi's glory, but possessed none of his discipline. While Yi languished in his cell, listening to the drip of water and the scuttling of rats, this new commander was given control of Joseon's entire fleet, the admiral's life's work. Each ship was a vessel Yi knew intimately, from the grain of its timber to the spirit of its crew. Eager for a victory that would cement his own legend, the rival sailed the navy straight into a Japanese ambush. It was not a battle, it was an annihilation. The slaughter that followed erased the Joseon navy from existence. In the confines of his prison, Yi heard the rumors, fragmented whispers from the guards about a great disaster at sea, about fire consuming the water. He closed his eyes and could see it. The splintering of pine, the snapped masts, the screams of his men swallowed by the waves. Of nearly 200 warships, only 12 survived, scattering like frightened animals. The news hit the capital like a death blow. The sea, once Joseon's fortress, was now a Japanese highway. Their armies, now easily resupplied, could push forward unopposed. The final collapse of the nation was imminent. In his panic, the king's only hope was the hero he had left to rot. The pardon was not an apology, it was an act of pure desperation. But the real question was, could a disgraced man, armed with nothing but ghosts and the wreckage of a once great navy, truly stand against an empire? The sight that greeted Yi Sun-sin upon his release was a portrait of profound despair. On the southern coast, 12 battered ships lay huddled in a small cove, their hulls scarred and their sails in tatters. They looked less like warships and more like ancient, wounded beasts that had crawled ashore to die. He walked through the makeshift camp, the air thick with the smell of damp wood, stale fear, and defeat. The men, his men, were hollowed-out shells of the proud sailors he once led. Their eyes were vacant, haunted by the memory of the fire and the screams of their drowning comrades. They were sailors who had lost their sea, warriors who had lost their will to fight. They looked at their returned commander with a flicker of awe, the last ember of a dying fire. He was the undefeated legend. But what could even he do now? What magic could he possibly work with these few splintered remains? The feeling of hopelessness was not just a whisper in the camp, it was a roar from the throne. A royal decree arrived, carried by a messenger whose own face was a mask of grim finality. The message was simple and devastating. The situation was hopeless. The king and his court had concluded that their tiny naval force could not possibly survive. It was a royal command to surrender. Yi was ordered to scuttle his ships, to sink what little remained of their naval pride, and march his men to join the land army. As Yi read the order aloud to his officers in the dim light of his tent, a heavy silence fell, so thick it felt like they were already at the bottom of the sea. This was the end. Their last, desperate stand was over before it had even begun. They looked at their admiral, their faces etched with resignation, expecting him to give the order to abandon ship. Instead, he folded the decree with a calm, deliberate motion. He looked past them, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he could see the future itself, and began to write. He drafted a letter to the throne that would echo through history. It was not a plea. It was a statement of pure, unyielding defiance. "Your Majesty," he wrote, "I still have 12 ships under my command, and I am still alive. As long as I live, the enemy will never dare to look down upon our seas." That single sentence was a thunderclap in the silence of despair. The words spread through the tiny fleet like wildfire, igniting a spark in hearts that had long gone cold. This was the leader they remembered, the man who did not know how to retreat. A few days later, as if drawn by this renewed spirit, a 13th ship, whose captain had hidden it away after the defeat, arrived to join them. Now they were 13. A pitiful number, but no longer just a collection of survivors. It was a statement. This was the moment the tide of the war began to turn. To see more stories of leaders who changed history, make sure you subscribe. Yi began the painstaking work of transforming these men. He knew their spirits were more damaged than the ship's hulls. He did not give grand speeches. His leadership was in his presence, his unwavering resolve, a rock in their sea of fear. He walked among them, inspecting the repairs, his quiet confidence, a silent promise. He drilled them relentlessly, the familiar rhythms of naval discipline, a balm for their fractured minds. He shared their meager rations, proving that their admiral suffered as they suffered. He listened to their nightmares, not with pity, but with an understanding that forged a bond stronger than steel. He was not just rebuilding a naval unit, he was reforging their souls. He was teaching them to believe again, not in the strength of their numbers, but in the mind of their commander. But belief alone wouldn't win this war. An enemy fleet, hundreds strong, was hunting them down, and Yi was leading his tiny flock directly towards them. He knew he couldn't win a fair fight, so he decided not to fight one. History is shaped by men, but it is commanded by the sea. Admiral Yi knew his 13 ships were no match for the Japanese fleet in open water. To win, he needed a weapon greater than cannons, stronger than steel. He found it in the geography of his homeland, a narrow, treacherous stretch of water called the Myeongnyang Strait. The locals called it Uldolmok, the Roaring Strait. It was a place of legend, a natural death trap, where the sea itself became a monster. The strait was a tight bottleneck, barely 300 meters wide. Twice a day, the tide would force its way through this gap with the power of a raging river, creating currents so fast they could tear a ship apart. The water would churn into whirlpools powerful enough to pull vessels under, its roar echoing for miles, a constant, hungry sound. Then, for a brief, eerie moment, the current would stop, the roaring would cease, and the sea would hold its breath before reversing, flowing with equal fury the other way. This was to be Yi's killing ground. He wasn't just choosing a defensive position, he was choosing his primary weapon. His plan was a work of strategic genius, born from pure desperation. He would use his own ships as bait, luring the enemy's vanguard into the strait precisely when the tide was flowing against them. Their massive fleet would be pinned, their speed and maneuverability crippled by a current they could not fight. They would be trapped, helpless targets. Then, when the tide turned, the reversing sea would throw their fleet into chaos, smashing their ships together and turning their retreat into a rout. The Japanese, meanwhile, were closing in. Their vanguard of at least 130 warships saw Yi's tiny fleet as an insignificant chore. Their scouts warned of the strait's dangers, but their commanders, blinded by overwhelming confidence, saw the currents as a manageable nuisance. The idea that 13 ships would willingly offer battle was so absurd it was an insult they were eager to answer. On the morning of October 26th, the trap was set. On the horizon, A forest of masts appeared, a red sun glinting off thousands of helmets and spear points. The red banners of the Japanese fleet blotted out the sky. Yi's plan depended on the sea obeying its ancient rhythm, on the enemy's arrogance, and on his own terrified men holding their nerve against a living nightmare. The roaring strait was waiting, and the fate of a nation would be decided in its violent, churning waters. As the Japanese vanguard entered the strait, they found something that defied all military logic. A single warship, Admiral Yi's flagship, floated alone in the middle of the channel, motionless against the current. It was a lone sentinel, a mountain of wood and iron, daring an entire navy to attack. The sight was so bizarre that the enemy hesitated, but behind Yi there was nothing. His other 12 ships were hanging back, their captains paralyzed by a primal, overwhelming fear. Yi Sun-sin was completely alone. The Japanese surged forward, and dozens of ships swarmed his flagship, the air filled with the roar of cannons and splintering wood. Grappling hooks the size of men flew through the air, sinking into the ship's rails. Japanese samurai, screaming battle cries, swarmed the sides, attempting to board. The fight was a brutal, claustrophobic melee. Yi's flagship became an island of defiance in a sea of enemies. Its cannons, firing at point-blank range, blasted enemy ships apart. But for every vessel that fell back, 2 more took its place. Yi stood on the command deck, a figure of impossible calm in the heart of the storm, his voice never rising, a clear, steady presence that cut through the din of battle. He directed his gunners, issued orders to repel boarders, and watched as his ship was torn apart, its hull breached, its sails shredded, its decks slick with blood, but its flag still flew. Seeing his admiral on the verge of being overwhelmed, the captain of a ship far behind Yi's line began to turn away, to flee. Yi saw it. He knew in that instant that courage was a flame that could either spread or be extinguished. If fear won, all was lost. He ordered a signal given, summoning the retreating captain to his own ship. In the midst of the swirling chaos, the man was brought before him. In full view of the other captains watching from their decks, Yi looked at him with cold fury and had him executed on the spot. It was a brutal, merciless act, but it was the shock the fleet needed. He then turned his gaze to the other captains and roared, "Do you seek to be judged by military law? Do you wish to flee? There is nowhere to run. To retreat is to die." The fear that had paralyzed his men was instantly replaced by a greater fear, the fury of their admiral. Shamed and terrified, they surged forward. Just as they did, the sea itself seemed to answer. The furious current holding the Japanese in place began to slow. For a few breathless moments, the roaring strait fell quiet. And then, with a terrifying roar, the tide turned. The current reversed. The Japanese fleet was thrown into utter chaos, their ships dragged backward, crashing into each other. Oars snapped, rudders broke, their perfect formations collapsed into a panicked mob of helpless colliding ships. The trap was sprung. And as the enemy descended into chaos, Yi's 12 other ships, their courage restored, finally charged into the fight like a wave of avenging steel. What would you do if you were one of the other 12 captains? Let us know in the comments below. A battle is won not when the last enemy falls, but when their will is broken. In the Myeongnyang Strait, the Japanese will evaporated. The moment the tide turned, the hunters became the hunted. The narrow channel that was their path to victory had now become their tomb. The disciplined fleet devolved into a panicked scramble for survival, their ships now helpless prey for Yi's warships. The battle transformed into a brutal, one-sided pursuit. At the heart of the vanguard was the enemy's most aggressive commander, a feared pirate warrior. His brightly decorated flagship became a primary target. In the chaos, Joseon's sailors boarded his ship and killed him. Admiral Yi gave a chilling order. He had the enemy commander's body pulled from the water, beheaded, and the head raised high on the mast of his own flagship. It was a terrifying, visceral message to the rest of the fleet. Their leaders were dead, their gods had abandoned them, and there would be no mercy. The psychological blow was decisive. Panic turned into a full-scale rout. The Japanese ships, still pouring into the strait, collided with those desperately trying to flee, creating a bottleneck of death. When the fighting finally ceased, the silence was more profound than the noise had been. The strait was a graveyard of shattered timber and drowned men. The scale of the victory was unbelievable. Over 30 Japanese warships had been sunk or destroyed. Thousands of their sailors and samurai were dead. On the Joseon side, not a single ship was lost. This single act of defiance did more than win a battle, it saved a nation. The devastating loss severed the Japanese army's supply lines and ignited a fire of resistance that ultimately forced their retreat. The victory at Myeongnyang was absolute. Though his body would fall in a later battle, his last words, an order to hide his death, to keep his men's courage high, Yi's spirit became immortal. He was the commander who, in his nation's darkest hour, took 13 broken ships and faced down an empire. His story, captured in the pages of his war diary that survives to this day, is a powerful testament that history is not always written by the largest armies, but by those with the courage to stand when all others flee. It is why his statue stands today in the heart of Seoul, not as a monument to a man, but as a reminder that as long as one person holds on to hope, a nation can never truly be defeated. Sharing this incredible story of defiance helps us bring more of history's greatest battles to light. Thank you for joining us. If you want to see more stories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.